In the shadows of modern Russia, where power is absolute and dissent often carries a death sentence, there is one man whose very existence defies the logic of the Kremlin. He is not the richest oligarch, nor the most powerful general. He does not command an army or control vast energy resources. Yet, somehow, he has become one of the greatest threats to Vladimir Putin's grip on power. And here is the question that has haunted analysts, intelligence agencies, and ordinary Russians alike. Why is he still alive? The story begins with an unsettling truth. In Putin's Russia, political opponents rarely last long. Journalists critical of the regime have been found murdered in stairwells. Opposition leaders have been shot in the heart of Moscow, in full view of the Kremlin's walls. Exiled dissidents have been poisoned abroad with substances so rare that only a state apparatus could possibly access them. And those who dare to stand up to Putin usually meet one of three fates: silence, exile, or death. Yet this man, loud, visible, defiant, continues to breathe. As dawn broke over Moscow in the early 2000s, the city was still healing from the violent chaos of the post-Soviet collapse. It was during this fragile moment that Putin rose, promising order, stability, and a return to Russian greatness. Many fell in line, grateful for an end to the turbulence. But there was one man who looked at Putin and saw not a savior, but a tyrant in the making. His name would soon become a symbol either of hope or of reckless defiance, depending on who you asked. He was charismatic, intelligent, and utterly unafraid to speak his mind. Where others whispered their discontent in kitchens or behind closed doors, he shouted it from stages, from interviews, from prison cells. He was the kind of man who could not be silenced, no matter how many chains were placed upon him. For every blow the state tried to deliver, he somehow found a way back. It was as if the more they tried to erase him, the stronger his voice became. And this terrified Putin. But before we dive into their collision, we must understand why this man was so dangerous. Russia is not a country where opposition movements grow naturally. The Kremlin is a machine of power, crushing dissent with precision. Political opponents are branded as foreign agents, their organizations dismantled, their followers harassed. But this man managed to inspire ordinary Russians in a way few others could. He did not hide behind jargon or abstract speeches. He spoke plainly, directly, as if addressing each person individually. He used the internet, a weapon the Kremlin underestimated for years, to bypass state media and reveal truths about corruption at the highest levels. One of his most famous videos showed, with cold precision, the palaces, yachts, and hidden fortunes of Russia's elite. It was a bombshell. Ordinary Russians, who had long suspected corruption, were now staring at undeniable proof. While they struggled with low wages and crumbling infrastructure, the ruling class was living like kings. That video alone reached millions, an earthquake in a country where information is tightly controlled. And at the center of it all stood this one man, pointing a finger at Putin himself. So why didn't Putin eliminate him immediately? Why not silence him as had been done with others before? The answer lies in a dangerous game of perception. Killing him outright would risk turning him into a martyr, a rallying cry for millions of disillusioned Russians. Exiling him could work, but his voice had already proven too powerful to be contained by borders. And so Putin tried another tactic: break him without killing him. Prison sentences, trumped-up charges, smear campaigns, physical attacks. The goal was not just to silence him, but to crush the very idea that resistance was possible. But here is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Each attempt to destroy him only seemed to make him stronger. He did not just endure prison, he used it to amplify his voice. He did not just survive attempts on his life, he turned them into global spectacles that exposed the brutality of the Kremlin. It was as if he had turned survival itself into a weapon. Imagine, for a moment, the paranoia inside the Kremlin walls. Putin, a man obsessed with control, facing an opponent he could not predict, could not fully eliminate, and could not ignore. A man who refused to play by the rules of fear. Every day that this man walks free or even behind bars yet still speaking is a day that Putin's absolute control looks less absolute. But perhaps the most dangerous part of this story is not the man himself, but what he represents. For years, Putin has ruled by convincing Russians that opposition is futile, that resistance leads only to death or exile. Yet here stands living proof that defiance is possible. His survival is not just a personal victory. It is a crack in the armor of authoritarianism. And cracks, as history has shown, have a way of spreading. Now, let us rewind the clock. Before the prison cells, before the poisonings, before the name became global headlines. Who was this man? Where did his defiance come from? And how did he become the one figure Putin could not fully erase? The answers lie in his unlikely rise. Born into the turbulence of late Soviet Russia, he was not born into power. He did not inherit billions or command political dynasties. Instead, he grew up like millions of other Russians, navigating a country collapsing under the weight of corruption and inefficiency. What set him apart was a relentless curiosity, a sharp intellect, and a refusal to accept that things had to remain the way they were. He began as a lawyer, a detail that would later prove crucial. Trained in the language of law and accountability, he used those tools to dissect the corruption that most Russians had accepted as an unchangeable fact of life. He started small, exposing local officials, drawing attention to shady deals. But his investigations kept climbing higher, pulling him closer and closer to the very top of the pyramid, until his accusations pointed directly at Vladimir Putin himself. It was then that his path became irreversible. The Kremlin could tolerate small-time critics, could tolerate activists, journalists, even regional protests. But a man capable of articulating national outrage, of turning complex schemes into simple narratives that resonated with ordinary citizens, this was different. This was dangerous. By the late 2000s, his name was known across Russia. By the 2010s, it was known across the world. And by then, the Kremlin had already tried multiple ways to silence him. Yet each time he came back stronger. The battle lines were drawn, not between two politicians, but between one man and an entire system designed to crush him. And this brings us back to the haunting question. How has he survived? Every factor, political, strategic, even symbolic, plays a role. Some argue that Putin fears turning him into a martyr. Others believe international pressure makes it too costly to eliminate him outright. Some whisper that his survival is a calculated move, that the Kremlin prefers him alive but contained, as a way to control the opposition. But whatever the reason, one truth remains. This man continues to stand as the one voice Putin has not fully silenced. His very existence is an act of defiance. And in a country where silence is survival, that makes him extraordinary. As we move deeper into this story, we will uncover not only his rise, but the countless times he stared death in the face and refused to back down. The poisonings, the prison cells, the global campaigns that turned his name into a symbol of resistance. Because this is not just the story of one man versus Putin. It is the story of how defiance itself can survive in the darkest of times. And the question we must all ask ourselves is this: if Putin cannot control him, what does that say about the future of Russia? In Russia, alliances are often not built on trust, but on necessity. History has shown that those who climb the ladder of power in Moscow usually do so by loyalty, cunning, and absolute submission to the man at the top. Yet there has always been one figure who defied this unwritten law. The untamed ally, brutal, erratic, yet indispensable, rose not as a polished politician or a disciplined soldier, but as a product of chaos. He thrived in disorder where others withered, and in doing so, he became both Putin's most useful creation and his most dangerous problem. To understand his rise, we need to go back to the turbulent years of post-Soviet Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the country descended into economic despair and lawlessness. Gangsters ruled the streets, oligarchs seized state assets, and violence became the common language of power. For most ordinary Russians, this was a time of humiliation and survival. But for some, it was also a time of opportunity. The man who would later become Putin's uncontrollable ally grew up with little privilege. He came from poverty, where hunger, fear, and violence were part of daily life. He was not shaped by the elite academies of Moscow nor groomed in the ranks of the KGB like Putin. Instead, he came from the raw edges of society, where fists and ruthlessness counted more than intellect or diplomacy. He learned early that survival required not just toughness, but also audacity, the willingness to cross lines that others feared to approach. In the 1990s, while Putin was carefully maneuvering his way into political power through the bureaucracy of St. Petersburg and later the Kremlin, this man was forging his empire in the shadows. He entered the world of organized crime, black market dealings, and mercenary work. He was not subtle, and he was certainly not polished. But he knew how to command loyalty, and above all, he knew how to use violence as a currency. By the early 2000s, Putin had risen to the presidency, promising stability, order, and the restoration of Russian pride. To enforce this vision, he needed men who could do what the traditional army and bureaucracy could not: fight dirty wars, intimidate enemies, and operate in the gray zones of geopolitics where official Russia could not afford to be seen. The untamed ally was perfectly suited for this role. He first gained prominence during the brutal wars in Chechnya, where Russian forces struggled to suppress separatists in the Caucasus. These wars were not just military conflicts, they were dirty, urban battles fought street by street, building by building, with atrocities on both sides. The Kremlin needed fighters who were ruthless, efficient, and unafraid of getting their hands bloody. And that is exactly what this man delivered. He built networks of fighters, hardened veterans, disillusioned soldiers, and men who had little left to lose. They followed him not out of loyalty to Russia, nor out of patriotism, but because he embodied their anger, their need for purpose, and their desire for revenge against a system that had abandoned them. These men would later form the core of a paramilitary machine that became both feared and indispensable. Putin saw the usefulness immediately. The untamed ally was not restrained by laws, nor by morality. He could do what the Russian state could not be seen doing. He could act in the shadows, giving Moscow plausible deniability. In many ways, he was the perfect tool. But therein lay the problem. He was not a tool willing to remain in the box. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, his influence expanded. He was involved in overseas operations in Syria, in Africa, in Ukraine, wherever the Kremlin needed a combination of muscle and deniability. His fighters were brutal, often accused of war crimes and atrocities, but they got results. And in Putin's Russia, results mattered more than appearances. Yet as his empire grew, so did his ego. Unlike other loyal servants of the Kremlin who kept their heads down, he spoke loudly, crudely, and often insultingly. He mocked Russian generals, calling them incompetent and corrupt. He criticized ministers openly, something few dared to do. In a country where most politicians carefully measured their words to stay in the Kremlin's favor, he seemed to relish in crossing the line. At first, Putin tolerated it. Perhaps he believed fear and dependency would keep the man in check. Or perhaps he saw him as too valuable to silence. After all, his paramilitary machine provided victories where the Russian military often failed. And every time it seemed that his defiance might lead to his downfall, he emerged even stronger, as though the rules simply did not apply to him. This raised an extraordinary question. How could a man survive in Putin's Russia while openly challenging the establishment? The Kremlin had crushed oligarchs, silenced journalists, and eliminated opposition leaders for far less. Why was this man still standing? The answer lies partly in his unique connection to ordinary Russians. While Putin positioned himself as the strongman president who restored national pride, he often appeared distant, calculating, and cold. The untamed ally, however, spoke in the raw, vulgar language of the streets. He cursed, he raged, he mocked, and ordinary soldiers, as well as many citizens, found this authenticity refreshing. He became a kind of populist figure, someone who dared to say what others were too afraid to. By the mid-2010s, his power was no longer confined to the battlefield. He built businesses, propaganda channels, and networks that extended across Russia and beyond. He was no longer just a warlord. He was becoming a political force. And in Putin's Russia, there is only room for one political force. The Kremlin grew uneasy. The FSB distrusted him, regarding him as unpredictable and dangerous. The generals despised him, humiliated by his constant insults. And yet, Putin hesitated. He knew that removing him outright might provoke unrest among his fighters, who could turn their weapons against Moscow itself. The untamed ally was too deeply embedded, too heavily armed, and too capable of destabilizing the system. Still, usefulness has an expiration date. Every empire built on violence eventually tests the patience of its master. And as Russia drifted closer to its largest war since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the presence of this untamed ally became more than just a nuisance. It became a threat. Ukraine would be the breaking point. There, in the crucible of Europe's bloodiest war since World War II, the untamed ally would find his moment to step fully out of the shadows. He would rally his men, seize headlines, and openly defy the very generals and ministers who were supposed to represent Putin's unchallenged control. For years, he had danced on the edge of survival. But in Ukraine, that dance would become a march that led straight into a confrontation with the Kremlin itself. What had started as a tool of convenience, a weapon to be used and discarded, was now evolving into something Putin had always feared, a rival. And in Russia, rivals are not meant to live long. But this man was no ordinary rival. He was the one man Putin could not seem to control. And the question that haunted both his enemies and his supporters was simple. How much longer could he defy the fate that had claimed all others before him? In the heart of Russia's vast landscape of oligarchs, power brokers, and Kremlin loyalists, Yevgeny Prigozhin carved out a kingdom unlike any other. His ascent was neither traditional nor elegant, but it was brutal, resourceful, and effective. While Putin's other allies built fortunes through oil, gas, or banking, Prigozhin built his empire on something far more dangerous: the monopoly of violence. By the late 2010s, the Wagner Group had transformed from a shadowy private military company into a global tool of Russian power projection. Officially, it didn't exist, at least not in the legal frameworks of the Russian Federation. Moscow denied its very presence. But on the ground, in Africa, the Middle East, and even Latin America, Wagner fighters were carving Russia's presence into the world map with bullets, contracts, and intimidation. This was where Prigozhin's genius truly revealed itself. He understood something the Kremlin had long been missing: plausible deniability. Wagner allowed Putin to interfere in wars, secure resources, and intimidate rivals, all while maintaining the facade of Russian non-involvement. If Wagner mercenaries were caught or killed, the Kremlin could shrug its shoulders and deny responsibility. It was the perfect hybrid of state power and organized crime. But Wagner was more than just a military group. It became an ecosystem. Through shell companies and murky financial networks, Prigozhin created a web of businesses that extracted wealth from wherever his fighters deployed. In the Central African Republic, Wagner controlled diamond mines. In Sudan, it tapped into gold reserves. In Syria, it was oil. Each battlefield became both a war zone and a business venture, enriching Prigozhin while extending Moscow's reach. For African leaders facing rebellion or unrest, Wagner offered something Western powers often did not: immediate, ruthless support. Where the United Nations brought resolutions and the French military brought bureaucracy, Prigozhin brought men with guns who would crush opposition without asking questions. In return, Wagner demanded concessions, mineral rights, strategic access, political loyalty. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't ideology. It was raw transactional power. But what made Wagner unique was how personal it was to Prigozhin. While Russian oligarchs were often faceless, hiding behind corporations and middlemen, Prigozhin relished being the visible face of his empire. He would travel to war zones, pose with soldiers, record videos in camouflage, and speak directly to both his fighters and the world. He wanted recognition. He wanted fear. And this created tension inside Russia. Other oligarchs played by the Kremlin's rules. They enriched themselves but deferred to Putin, avoiding the spotlight. Prigozhin was different. He didn't just want wealth, he wanted influence, perhaps even legitimacy. And in Putin's Russia, where only one man holds true power, that was dangerous. One of the clearest demonstrations of Prigozhin's growing independence came during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. At first, Wagner was a supplement filling gaps in the Russian military effort. But as months dragged on, it became clear that Wagner was not just filling gaps. It was outperforming the official Russian army. In places like Bakhmut, Wagner fighters, many of them recruited directly from prisons, fought with a ferocity and brutality that stunned both allies and enemies. They advanced where regular Russian units stalled. They took ground at staggering human cost. And Prigozhin made sure the world knew it. He filmed himself inside captured territory, mocking Russian generals who stayed behind desks. He accused the Ministry of Defense of incompetence, corruption, and cowardice. In videos that spread across Telegram channels, he stood among rows of dead Wagner soldiers, shouting that the blood was on the hands of Russia's military leadership. This was more than criticism, it was open defiance. In Putin's Russia, even mild disagreement from oligarchs could lead to exile or worse. But Prigozhin wasn't whispering in the shadows. He was screaming into the camera. And millions of Russians were listening. For ordinary citizens frustrated by endless mobilization, rising casualties, and a sense of corruption at the top, Prigozhin became something unusual. A truth-teller. A warlord, yes, but one who dared to say what others would not. He tapped into a populist vein of anger that the Kremlin had long sought to control. And for the first time, Putin's carefully crafted monopoly on loyalty seemed to fracture. But Wagner's battlefield success and Prigozhin's political defiance brought inevitable backlash. The Ministry of Defense, led by Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, saw Prigozhin not only as a nuisance but as a direct threat. Wagner had become a rival institution within Russia's war machine, and Prigozhin himself was behaving less like an obedient servant and more like a dangerous contender. The Kremlin began to tighten its grip. Ammunition supplies to Wagner were restricted, forcing Prigozhin to beg publicly for shells. Contracts were rewritten, attempting to bring Wagner under full Ministry of Defense control. But Prigozhin resisted, denouncing what he called bureaucratic sabotage of his fighters. It was an extraordinary dynamic. A private warlord openly accusing Russia's top generals of treachery while still claiming loyalty to Putin. It was as though Prigozhin believed he could separate Putin from the machine of the Russian state, that he could appeal directly to the president while undermining his most powerful subordinates. For a time, it seemed to work. Putin allowed Prigozhin to continue his tirades, perhaps finding them useful in keeping the generals in check. But the cost was that Wagner grew more and more independent, and Prigozhin's voice louder. Outside of Ukraine, Wagner continued to thrive. In Mali, it replaced French forces as the dominant foreign military presence, brutally suppressing insurgents while securing contracts for gold mines. In Libya, Wagner backed strongman Khalifa Haftar, giving Moscow a foothold in North Africa. And in the Central African Republic, Wagner fighters became the president's personal guard, embedding themselves so deeply that the local government was practically a client state of Prigozhin's empire. Western intelligence agencies watched with alarm as Wagner spread its tentacles. What they saw was not just a mercenary group but a parallel foreign policy, one that often operated beyond even the Kremlin's control. Wagner's actions weren't always aligned with Moscow's strategic goals. They were aligned with Prigozhin's. And that was the key problem. Prigozhin's ambitions were no longer just about serving Russia. They were about serving himself. He built a loyal army of tens of thousands, he controlled resource flows worth billions, and he cultivated an image as a man unafraid to challenge the establishment. This was no longer Putin's chef. This was a warlord, operating both inside and outside Russia's borders, and one whose influence was growing too large to ignore. But here lies the paradox at the heart of Prigozhin's story. In Russia's system, every oligarch, every minister, every general ultimately survives by Putin's favor. Yet Prigozhin seemed to exist in a gray zone, too useful to destroy, too dangerous to fully control. And the question that haunted Moscow was simple. How long could this balance last? Because history has shown that in Putin's Russia, no rival power center survives forever. And yet, somehow, Prigozhin did. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Russia to its core. The seeds of rebellion were already being sown, and the man who had once served Putin meals was now daring to challenge the empire he helped build. The Kremlin had tried almost everything. Whispers of poisonings that never fully succeeded. car accidents that seemed staged yet ended with the man still alive. Associates disappearing into the void, leaving behind a trail of fear and silence. And yet, he remained. The man Putin could not control seemed to defy the very laws of Russian politics, where survival was rarely earned through luck, and loyalty was often just another word for obedience. By now, his story had become more than a political rivalry. It was a parable of defiance in a land where defiance was usually crushed. And the fact that he continued breathing, speaking, and moving within Russia's borders was nothing short of extraordinary. How had he managed it? That was the question whispered in Moscow cafes, in foreign intelligence briefings, and even within Putin's own circle. Some believed it was cunning. Others claimed he had powerful backers, shadows within the state who shielded him for reasons of their own. A few even argued that Putin allowed him to live as a useful symbol, a reminder to both allies and enemies that not even opposition could fully escape the reach of the Kremlin. But the truth was murkier, layered with betrayal, near-death escapes, and a resilience that bordered on myth. One episode in particular cemented his reputation as unbreakable. It began with a trip seemingly ordinary, a journey he had taken countless times before. The details would later emerge in fragments, pieced together by investigative journalists who risked everything to uncover them. A bottle of water, later found to contain traces of a substance once developed in Soviet laboratories. A sudden collapse mid-flight, the frantic emergency landing, the coma that nearly became permanent, and then, against every odd, his survival. The world watched in stunned silence. Western leaders demanded explanations. The Kremlin denied everything, as it always did. Nothing happened. Their spokesperson insisted, calling the accusations a Western smear campaign. But few believed it. The poison bore the fingerprints of state machinery. And the man's survival was not just a personal victory, it was a humiliation for Putin. When he reappeared months later, thinner, frilier, but alive, his image became something more powerful than the Kremlin's propaganda could counter. Videos of him speaking, his voice hoarse but steady, spread like wildfire across social media. Russians saw not just a man, but a symbol. One who had looked death in the face, one who had stared down the machinery of the state and still lived to tell the tale. But survival came at a cost. Those around him were not always so fortunate. Close allies faced arrests, intimidation, or exile. His family became constant targets of surveillance. His movements were tracked, his phones tapped, his meetings infiltrated. Each day he remained free was another act of defiance, but also another invitation for the Kremlin to tighten the noose. Inside Russia, the consequences of his continued existence rippled through the elite. Some oligarchs grumbled privately, questioning why Putin allowed this dangerous figure to keep breathing. Generals muttered in closed rooms about discipline and fear slipping. For in the language of authoritarian power, survival equals weakness, and if Putin could not eliminate this man, what else might he fail to control? Outside Russia, intelligence agencies debated the same puzzle. How had he managed to survive where so many others had not? Names like Litvinenko and Politkovskaya came to mind, martyrs whose lives were cut short by bullets or poison. But this man endured. To Western strategists, his resilience suggested not just personal luck, but a fracture within the Kremlin system. Someone, somewhere, was either protecting him or preventing his elimination. That possibility alone terrified Putin. It was during this period that rumors began to swirl of betrayal within the Russian state itself. High-ranking officials, once loyal to Putin, had begun questioning his decisions behind closed doors. The war in Ukraine had strained resources, isolated Russia globally, and weakened the aura of invincibility that Putin cultivated. Could it be that some within his own machinery saw the man he could not control as a useful pressure point? Perhaps, perhaps not. In Moscow, rumor was more dangerous than truth. Still, the man himself never claimed such protection. He insisted instead that his survival was rooted in his willingness to keep speaking, to keep showing his face, to refuse the silence that so many others had accepted before him. "They want fear," he once said in a leaked interview. "But if you refuse to fear them, they lose." It was a bold declaration, the kind that made his supporters cheer and his enemies seethe. Putin's frustration reportedly boiled over in private. According to insiders, he raged about the embarrassment of failed operations, the insult of survival. For a leader obsessed with strength, with control, with the image of inevitability, there was no greater insult than a man who simply refused to die. And so, the Kremlin shifted strategies. Where direct elimination had failed, it turned to erosion. Smear campaigns flooded state television, branding him a foreign agent, a traitor, a man selling out Russia to the West. Laws were passed, conveniently targeting his organizations, freezing his accounts, dismantling his networks. The courts, obedient to the Kremlin, issued rulings that would have buried any other figure. And yet, he endured. Each crackdown only seemed to strengthen his legend. Each failed attempt to silence him became another story whispered across Russia, another meme shared online, another sign that the machine was not invincible. For the Kremlin, it was like fighting a shadow. Every strike missed, and every miss made the shadow larger. But survival is not the same as victory, and the weight of living under constant threat carved itself into the man's body and spirit. He spoke of sleepless nights, of the burden of knowing that every step could be his last, of the guilt of watching allies fall while he remained. His life was both triumph and torment, a symbol of freedom and a cage of its own making. Internationally, his endurance forced uncomfortable questions. Western leaders, eager to champion democracy, often invoked his name, yet few were willing to act decisively in his defense. Sanctions were imposed, condemnations issued, but the Kremlin still stood, and Putin remained in power. In truth, his survival embarrassed not only Moscow but also the West, which could not fully protect him nor bring about the change his existence symbolized. By the time the calendar turned once more, and Russia's political theater staged yet another election, he remained the unresolved thread in Putin's tapestry. A man the Kremlin could not destroy, a man the West could not save, and a man whose own people saw as both inspiration and warning. The question now was not just how long he could survive, but what his survival meant for the future of Russia. Was he the spark that would one day ignite something larger? Or was he a ghost destined to haunt Putin without ever toppling him? In that uncertainty lay both hope and fear. The man Putin could not control had become a paradox. Too weak to overthrow the system, too strong to be erased by it. And as the months dragged on, one truth became clear. His very existence was a reminder that Putin's power, for all its brutality, was not absolute. The story of Yevgeny Prigozhin is not one that ends neatly. It is not a tale that offers clear lessons or clean conclusions. Instead, it lingers in the gray zones of power, loyalty, betrayal, and survival. To understand why he is still alive, or at least why his shadow remains larger than his grave, you need to look at how his legacy continues to haunt the Kremlin, the Russian people, and even the wider world. Because the real danger with men like Prigozhin is not just what they do while they live. It is what they leave behind when they fall. When the plane carrying Prigozhin fell from the sky, the world watched with a mix of shock and resignation. Many said, of course, it was inevitable. The West believed Putin had finally struck down the man who dared to defy him. Russian state media played its part, mourning him as a patriot while subtly framing him as reckless. Yet outside the official narrative, in the streets, in the conversations whispered in cafes and over secure phone calls, the question that mattered wasn't simply whether Prigozhin was dead. The question was, would the idea of Prigozhin, his rebellion, his defiance, live on? Because ideas are harder to kill than men. And in that moment, the Kremlin faced its greatest paradox. If Prigozhin had been eliminated, then why were Wagner fighters still loyal? Why were videos still emerging of masked men, armed and organized, raising the Wagner flag in deserts of Africa, in the ruins of Syrian cities, even in Russian towns? His influence stretched far beyond the reach of Moscow's censors. The more the state tried to erase him, the more his name echoed in the cracks of silence. But to truly grasp why Prigozhin's story doesn't end with his death, you need to understand the relationship between him and Putin. It was a marriage of convenience, born not out of trust but necessity. Putin needed Wagner to fight wars that Russia could not openly fight. Prigozhin needed Putin's blessing to expand his empire. But somewhere along the way, Prigozhin began to believe his power was his own. He mistook his leash for independence. And in doing so, he crossed the one man no one in Russia is supposed to cross. And yet, he survived longer than anyone thought possible. Longer than generals, ministers, even spies who once stood at Putin's side. That alone is telling. Because in Putin's Russia, survival is a message. The fact that Prigozhin's plane did not fall from the sky the day after his march on Moscow, but weeks later, shows that even Putin had to consider the cost of killing him. What was that cost? It was the loyalty of thousands of Wagner fighters scattered across continents. It was the balance of war in Ukraine, where Wagner had delivered victories others could not. It was the silent acknowledgement that Prigozhin was not just a man but a symbol. Symbols, after all, cannot be shot out of the sky so easily. And so, even in death or supposed death, Prigozhin lingers. In Africa, Wagner forces still guard presidents and exploit mines, acting as Russia's shadow empire. In Russia, mothers of soldiers still whisper his name as the one who dared to speak the truth about the incompetence of generals. Online, in encrypted chats, Wagner loyalists trade stories of his leadership, some convinced he is alive, others swearing vengeance for his downfall. The myth of Prigozhin is far more dangerous to Putin than the man ever was. Because myths inspire. They give people the courage to think the unthinkable. And in a Russia where fear is the currency of control, belief in the possibility of resistance, even if doomed, is a threat in itself. But what does this mean for the future? It means that the cracks in Putin's empire are visible. Prigozhin exposed them. He showed the Russian people and the world that even the most powerful leader in modern Russia could be challenged. His rebellion may have ended on the road to Moscow, but the message traveled far beyond that. It whispered to oligarchs, to generals, to soldiers, Putin can be defied. And once an idea like that exists, it cannot be erased no matter how many planes fall from the sky. Still, the question remains, why did Putin not act sooner? Why allow Prigozhin to march, to speak, to live as long as he did? The answer lies not in mercy but calculation. Putin is a master of timing. He knows when to let enemies destroy themselves, when to hold his hand, and when to strike. By waiting, he allowed Prigozhin to overreach, to show his hand, to reveal his network. When the blow came, it was decisive. But the delay gave Prigozhin the chance to carve his name into history, to become a legend rather than a forgotten traitor. And legends are harder to bury than men. Today, the Kremlin speaks of Wagner as though it has been dismantled. But in reality, the network survives. Its fighters rebranded under different commands. Its influence spread through shell companies and cutouts. Its myth alive in the memory of every man who marched with Prigozhin on that fateful day toward Moscow. Even if the organization fades, the idea that someone inside Russia dared to stand against the Kremlin and lived long enough to tell the tale remains etched into history. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: was Prigozhin's rebellion ever truly about power? Or was it about survival in a system that consumes even its most loyal servants? Because in Russia, loyalty is not rewarded. It is weaponized. And when men like Prigozhin realize they are dispensable, they fight not for glory but to prove they exist. And in that sense, Prigozhin achieved what many before him could not. He made Putin blink. He forced the Kremlin to reveal its weakness, its fear of fracture, its reliance on men it cannot fully control. That, more than any battlefield victory, is his legacy. So, is Yevgeny Prigozhin truly dead? His body may lie in the ground. His voice may be silenced. But his ghost walks freely across battlefields, deserts, and corridors of power. In every whisper of rebellion, in every doubt cast on the Kremlin's authority, in every shadow where Wagner's men still stand, his presence endures. And that is why Putin cannot control him. Not anymore, because the dead are beyond control, and legends once born do not die. As we close this story, one thing is clear. The struggle between power and loyalty in Russia is far from over. Prigozhin's rise and fall was not the end of the story. It was a glimpse into the fractures within a regime that presents itself as unbreakable. And if history teaches us anything, it is that empires rarely fall from the outside. They collapse from within. So perhaps the real danger to Putin is not NATO, not sanctions, not wars abroad. Perhaps the real danger is the memory of a man who dared to walk the road to Moscow and showed the world that even the strongest autocrats can be challenged. The question is not whether Prigozhin is alive or dead. The question is, who will be next to test the Kremlin's power? And when they do, will the world be ready? Because sometimes the most dangerous men are not the ones who hold power, but the ones who break free from it. And in Russia, that truth lingers like a shadow, long after the flames of rebellion burn out. So what do you think? Is Prigozhin's legacy a warning to others, or an invitation? Could his defiance inspire the next great fracture in Putin's empire? Or was it only a fleeting rebellion, destined to be crushed under the weight of Russia's fear? One thing is certain: the story of Yevgeny Prigozhin is not over, and neither is the struggle for the soul of Russia. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who love history and politics, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden battles shaping our world. Because sometimes, the stories that matter most are the ones hiding in the shadows.